nonprofit that stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. DevSlop is only one of many projects with OWASP. OWASP is a community of developers, technologists, and evangelists improving the security of software through tools and resources. OWASP has 100 plus active projects, and new project applications are submitted weekly. Projects are open source and are built by our community of volunteers, people just like you. Community and networking. There are hundreds of local chapters worldwide and thousands of members. Meetings are free and open to everyone. They include training, talks, and networking opportunities. Education and training. OWASP hosts many events each year. They are a great way to improve your skills, build your professional network, and learn about new trends in the industry. One of the many ways you can get involved is to become a member. The membership benefits include discounts for events and trainings, your own OWASP email address and Google Workspace access, a vote in our OWASP Global Board elections. And recently, OWASP added a brand new member benefit, access to hands-on application security training through the OWASP Secure Flag Open Platform. Join us and become a member today.
Hello, I'm Nancy, and thank you for joining us on the OWASP DevSlop Show. Today's guest, Olivia Liddell, created a workbook to help beginning developers supplement their study of the OWASP Top 10. She'll discuss best practices for teaching security concepts to beginners. Stay with us, and we'll tell you how you can get your hands on your own copy.
Hello, Happy New Year to you all, and welcome to our very first show of the year. My name is Faith Appeal, and I'm happy to be here with my fellow co-hosts, Nikki Becker and Stefania Chaplin.
Stefania, where are we? Do you see everyone, Nancy, or is it just me?
I do see everyone.
All right, then
Stefania.
It's just me. All right, sorry about that. So Stefania, today's your first time co-hosting the DevSlop Show. Welcome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the audience?
I feel like Stefania is not hearing us. Yeah, I think that's what's happening.
Hey.
Okay, so you're hearing us now, Stefania? I don't think.
Yeah, sorry about that. Internet issues. So if you are new here, please make sure.
So I think we lost Stefania.
Okay, so let's keep going. So Stefania is joining us here for her first time. She's co-hosting. Hopefully, we'll get her back with some audio. Faith, let's go ahead and introduce, I guess, our new our guest for today.
Yeah. So as Nancy mentioned, our guest today is Olivia Liddell. Olivia is a technical curriculum developer at AWS, where she creates training courses for AWS Cloud Fundamentals. But today, Olivia is here to introduce her own personal project. She'll talk about two things. The first is application security, and the second, teaching methods of application security. So welcome, Olivia.
Hey, thank you so much for having me here. This is, I've been so excited to present this to not just all of you here, but everyone who's tuning in and maybe watching the recording later on. And as you mentioned, this is a personal side project I've been working on for a while now. And I can't wait to tell you all about what this workbook is, where it came from, and most importantly, how it can help beginning developers start to learn about the top 10 and consider more of a security career for themselves. So, can you see my screen okay?
Now awesome.
Great. So to get started, I tried to think about where did this all begin? And one of my personal favorite things to find is just ridiculous hacker clip art that's out there. And I looked at this and thought, wow. But also, this kind of represents a lot of what I think many beginning developers might feel about the idea of learning about security. I speak at a lot of conferences, and previously, before getting into curriculum development, was a technical trainer. So I've had a lot of conversations with people from all different skill levels about this topic of security. And what really stood out to me was attending some conferences, presenting on social engineering, for example, and then having some people come up to me afterwards to say, hey, really enjoyed your talk. I'm just getting started in tech and learning how to code. And I just really wish I could learn about security too. And I would ask them, well, why don't you? Not in like a snarky, condescending way, but just to seriously try to figure out, you're saying you're possibly interested in security, but you're afraid to get started. Why is that? Let's talk about that some more. And separately from that, about 2 years ago at Code Mash, I attended a security workshop that was led by Jim Manico, and it was a fantastic workshop. And at the very end, he had this call to action where he said that there's such a great need for people who can help communicate these ideas in a way that anyone can understand, especially those people who are just joining our community and want to learn about these things, but they might feel that they have to look like a security person or even be a security person, whatever that means. And so that's where this all began. And I started to think big. And one thing I'll tell you about any kind of project, but especially something that relates to teaching, is that it's so easy to fall into the trap of feeling that when you're creating something, your intended audience is everyone in the world. And that easily spirals out of control. So one of the biggest learning points for me with this was to narrow this down as much as I felt that I needed to. And first kind of disclaimer here is, if you look at this idea, like this gray box of teaching the OWASP top 10, which could encompass all possible teaching approaches, learning tools, target audiences, learning styles, everything in between. This workbook for beginning developers is a teeny tiny part of that. So does that kind of make sense? This idea that there's a lot of ways you can teach this, but this is only fitting for a small group.
Yes. Olivia, I'm pretty sure a lot of people already know about OWASP Top 10, but just to make sure that we have developers that have no idea what we're talking about, could you give us just a little bit of a summary of what is the OWASP Top 10?
Yeah, so the OWASP top 10 of web application security risks, this list of risks that when you're thinking from the perspective of all the attacks and risks that could happen for web applications, which are the ones that are most high priority, which ones can be have the highest impact to a business, which ones are most prevalent, and so forth. And so the idea is that for people who are starting to learn about how to write secure code, this isn't to say that this is a completely exhaustive list of these are the only 10 that they should learn about, but more so it's to be able to think and say, well, if I'm creating a web application and coding this, what are some potential ways that it could be broken? Perhaps, or what are some weaknesses? What are some trouble points that might exist within this application? And that can be anything from security misconfiguration, like keeping some of your default settings enabled and not changing that, which is one type of security problem, all the way to the other end of having someone perform a SQL injection on your database. And so as you're thinking about learning about these top 10, part of what I noticed was that many beginning developers would start from the list in order, and this is one thing that I'll get into a little bit later on. But it's a great way to start learning about application security, and what I wanted to do was make that process even easier and accessible for our beginning developers.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so continuing on, this is getting into some teaching methodology. And as with the process of writing code and figuring out what kind of application you're developing, when you're creating something through a teaching context, you always want to work backwards and start with some guiding questions. And I know for myself, it's so easy for me to rush headfirst into something and say, I have an idea, I want to do this thing, I want to make something. And then you kind of get into it and you realize, I don't know where I'm going. This has spiraled out of control. What is even coming together? And so with this, part of what I'm excited to be here today is that for any of you who are watching and following along with this, that you also may be thinking about wanting to create your own kind of workbook or training course related to the OWASP Top 10 or any other kind of technical topic. This is where you want to start. And you want to ask yourself, who do I want to help? And then also, in my case, what should learners be able to do as a result of completing this workbook? Because it's a very common trap that I fall in where I might say, all right, I teach something and someone understands this. But understand is such a weak word in the context of teaching, because sometimes you need to break that out a little bit more. And that leads into one of my favorite teaching tools, which is Bloom's taxonomy. Are any of you co-hosts familiar with this, Bloom's taxonomy?
No.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I heard an oh yes and a oh
Yeah.
no.
Oh no.
Nika's a teacher, right?
Well, I also use it as like a mini thesaurus. There's a lot of really great words inside Bloom's taxonomy that I think people should use as a thesaurus. So you don't have to keep saying the word understand over and over again. You can actually articulate that in a different way. So it's a little bit more action oriented. So yeah, but please tell us all about Bloom's taxonomy.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like the power pyramid, if you will. And it's it's a framework, or one of many frameworks that exists for being able to figure out and identify what your teaching outcome should be. And I started here because with the OWASP Top 10 and thinking about how beginning developers may need to approach this, what do I want them to be able to take away from this? Do I want them to be a little bit lower in the pyramid with defining some of these risks, or do I want the outcomes to be all the way at the top of the pyramid with what we call higher level thinking and designing, creating, developing something on their own? And I've put a link in this, and I'll share these slides out on my website afterwards for any of you who might want to reference this later, because this is going to be a really great guide for figuring out if you're creating your own workbook or course. Start here with some objectives. And so this is where Bloom's taxonomy led me. I figured out that I wanted to help beginning developers. Thinking back to those conversations I've had with beginning developers who feel that they want to learn about security, but they don't really know where to start, that's where I felt that I could really provide the most value. And to break that down even more, in my mind, as I was creating this, I thought beginning in the sense of someone who might have just started learning about how to write some HTML. Now they've learned some CSS and their web page is looking a little bit cute and fancy. And now they've added in a little bit of JavaScript so that there's some action on the page. Like, we're talking that level of beginner, because noticing that many of these developers don't learn about security until later on, I want to make sure that we can intervene earlier and get them interested in security at a much earlier point. And so to the second point, thinking about what learners should be able to do as a result of this, I wanted this to be very action oriented, but also not make it seem as though you come out of this workbook and you know everything there possibly is to know about the top 10. It's a starting point that you can use to build up, such as first identifying the risks that are included in the top 10, and then describing the top 10 risks. That's a part that's going to connect into what I'll talk a little bit more about later with reflection, because you might have some developers who know which risks are included in the list, but if you ask them to describe it in their own words, they might struggle with that. So that's a learning opportunity. Also, comparing and contrasting risks. One of the things that I see so much in my work at AWS when I'm developing curriculum is that so many of our services have the word cloud in them. Cloud this, cloud that, and cloud that other thing too. And that's something I also noticed with some of the top 10 risks, thinking about how can someone understand the difference between broken access control, broken authentication, and so on. And finally, relating the top 10 risks and prevention strategies to real life scenarios. One of the things that's very critical about adult learning theory is this importance of connecting what learners are receiving through their training to how they can actually apply that to a real world scenario. Because compared to teaching children, there's a lot that goes into that. But when someone is an adult, for the most part, they are able to connect more to what they're learning when they see the relevance and applicability of that. So you'll see that come up a little bit in the workbook. Any questions about this so far before we jump into the next part?
No, I think it's clear.
Awesome. So continuing on, this is where I started after I set my objectives and I thought, okay, we need to, for this workbook, look into shuffling around the top 10 somewhat. Because thinking about this from the perspective of someone who's a beginning developer, they might pull up some documentation, see that there's a top 10 list, and start from top to bottom. What's number one? Injection. Okay, so imagine from the perspective of someone who's about 1 month into learning how to write some HTML, CSS, maybe some JavaScript. Now they're reading about something that can relate to the concept of like a database, which they haven't even possibly considered yet in what they've learned so far. And as I thought about this, what I wanted to try to do was make it so that if I'm explaining one of these risks to a beginning developer, how can I lower that bar of entry to make it more accessible to them? Because here you have a developer who's starting to learn and they're like, well, before I can learn about what injection is, I'm seeing something that comes up in this documentation that I don't understand. I see this, I see something about SQL. I don't know what SQL is, so I need to understand that first before I have any hope of understanding injection. Same thing with like number 4, the XXE, the XML external entities. So that one, I bumped that one all the way down to the bottom. You'll see my reordered list in just a second. But again, thinking about when you're trying to explain a concept to someone, if every time you have to pause and say, oh, but wait, here's this other thing that you need to understand XML first. Okay, so now that you know that XML is a thing, now I need to explain what the concept of an entity is. And for someone who's a beginner, it can be very difficult to feel this kind of competence with this if you're constantly seeing that I don't understand that either, so I'm just going to nope out of here.
I'll just close my book and move.
Yeah.
You're giving them context for sure. Yeah.
Giving them context. And I thought about this from the perspective of if I wanted to just sit down with someone like some of my older relatives or some of my friends who are in non-technical roles and explain these things to them, which would be the easiest for them to understand and grasp? And this is by no means a perfect list. I'm sure other people may have different opinions on how they would approach it, and that is absolutely fine too. But the way I decided to settle this for the workbook would be to start with something like using components with known vulnerabilities, something that you can explain in context that exists outside of application development and security, relating things like broken access control to situations that they might have had in their own workplace with passwords and things like that. And you'll see in the workbook, there are guiding reflection questions that relate to this so that a learner will come into this workbook. They'll be presented with a short synopsis of how this particular risk might work and then connect it to something they already know. So that's another thing that's so important with adult learning theory, not just giving learners more information just nonstop, but making sure that as you continue to teach, you also are very intentional about connecting the pieces between them and starting to help develop this kind of matrix there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It might be, I might be jumping ahead, but what are those numbers next to each category, the green and red?
Oh yeah, that was just a way to illustrate, and I think I double checked they all add up, but just to kind of show you a comparison between, like, for instance, using components with known vulnerabilities. On the official OWASP order, that's number 9. In my companion workbook, I moved it up 8 spots there.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah, and I that was one of the last things I did, because I knew that I was moving things around a bit, but I wasn't sure until I actually sat down and thought, let's see how this compares. And it's not an exact, like, swap from top to bottom, but it was interesting to see which ones I decided to bump up a bit.
Okay, but the real list is just how the occurrence, the number of occurrence, like injection is more popular than broken authentication, therefore that's why it's number 1.
Yeah, and there's like I know there's like data that goes into that, and reports, and a lot of input there. Yeah,
Okay.
and so in the workbook, I mentioned in the beginning, like, there's an official list, and I'm sure with the workbook, people can feel free to jump around. Like, if they really want to know about injection, by all means, jump down to number 7 and have some fun with it. But I want them to feel that, okay, I can start here. I can start by using components with known vulnerabilities, and it's a much softer landing point, I think.
I think.
Question, Olivia. Oh, sorry, Faith. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Nikki.
Just a question about, I guess, how do you avoid going down a rabbit hole? Like, for example, I think we're all prone to this in this industry. You know, you want to explain an XXE attack, and then you start getting into XML parsing, and then what are you going to do as a result of achieving the XXE attack?
Yeah.
How do you slow it down and draw the boundary and say, you know what, this is all you need to know to prevent this kind of thing, and we don't have to, like, reinvent the universe here for this to be explained properly.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is exactly one of the things I included in one of the final slides on like reflection and feedback, because yeah, scope is so important. And I think in order to be able to explain something well, like you're saying, you have to, it's like playing chess in a way, because you have to be able to think not just one step ahead, but even 2, 3, 4 steps ahead, and think, if I'm taking the learner down this pathway, how much will they be able to really take away from this if I don't give them everything? And so I wanted to make sure in the workbook that there's this understanding that this is not at all intended to be an exhaustive explanation of this. And in fact, I mentioned in the initial, like, how to use this workbook part, that this is designed to be used together with whatever other study materials that the learners or that the developers decide to use on their own. So they're watching videos, they're reading books and so forth. And then they come to this workbook for that part of, okay, now how do I actually think about this? What are some of the most crucial parts to pull out of this? And there are some parts in there where you definitely do have to break it down quite a bit. And yeah, I don't mean to beat up on XML external entities, but that is, I mean,
it's a hard one.
You already know, yeah. And it's, but
yeah,
I will say, this is why
they're all hard.
They are, yeah.
Because even SQL injection, you start getting into how SQL works, and then union queries. Like, you can sort of go really off the rails quickly in a lot of these. So yeah,
you can, yeah. And also too, when you're as a curriculum developer, when it's different when you know the exact audience that you're developing curriculum for. So throughout different parts of my career, I've had it where I know I'm creating a course or a slideshow, whatever, for a very specific audience, and I know what their needs and use cases are, and I can tailor it exactly to them, versus this companion workbook, which is for anyone who wants to learn. So it has to be more general, and I can't always use those same scenarios that I would like. But I think that what I've tried to do with this is make it so that someone can read this, get the most essential information that they need. And I think that part of that reflection process is, and this is going into, this is a good segue, I think, here into this, what I consider the language of security. And so part of my background, I was telling Nancy as we were planning this, that my background is kind of all over the place in some points, but when I was in college, I studied linguistic anthropology. Also, earlier in my career, taught middle school Arabic in Chicago Public School. So no matter what I'm doing, linguistics will always be part of it. And here we are now, and this is really fun to kind of bridge together, because What's that?
Have you ever heard of Langsec?
Langsec. No, but that sounds like language and security, and I'm curious what that
Yeah,
is.
I'll
Wow.
link it. It's
Please
like a
do.
interesting a rabbit hole. I'm totally gonna take us down a rabbit hole, so I'm gonna
It's all
back
right.
out of it.
I'm totally taking us
Yeah.
down a rabbit hole too. I I thought about this, and so with I call this the language of security because when you're giving learners more content, and like what we were saying, of taking them down these different pathways of you need to understand this, which connects to that, which connects to this thing. A lot of it is very similar to linguistic theories around how you build up your skill in communicating. And I found this great quote from William von Humboldt, a German linguist in the 1700s, 1800s, who wrote, "We cannot really teach language. We can only create conditions in which it will develop spontaneously in the mind in its own way." And to give you a sense of the connection that I have between this, two quick little stories here. When I was in middle school and high school, that's when I started learning Spanish. And I had some okay teachers, but the way that they taught us was just learn this list of vocabulary, memorize it for the test, here's some conjugations, and just look up in the book whatever you need. And I mean, I can kind of say, hola, ¿cómo estás? Like when I travel to a Spanish speaking country, I go on Duolingo and hope for the best. But then when I was in college, I started learning Arabic, which I don't know if, do any of you speak Arabic by any chance?
No.
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 Okay. Yeah. So many people think that Arabic it can be a much more difficult language to learn, but I had an instructor who took an incredibly different approach that I used throughout all of my trainings, including this security workbook, which was. There was one day he asked me a question in class, and I was like, okay, I think I know what I want to tell you, but hold on, because I need to look this up. And he gave me this strange look like, Olivia, what are you doing? Like, I asked you a question, talk back to me now, don't go to the book. And I struggled. I mean, I really struggled because he asked me something like, what are you planning to do this weekend? And I think I couldn't remember the word for ice cream. So I said something really weird, like, I want to eat lots of very, very cold milk. I mean,
Close enough.
It's close enough. Yeah.
Could have been worse.
and he was like, okay, you college kids are a little bit strange, but good for you. But the point was, he was teaching us to use the tools that we already had instead of always going to look things up and never really learning how to work with our current tool set. And that's the exact same thing that connects to when you are teaching learners how to really speak about concepts. And I wanted to make sure that with this workbook, beginning developers would feel this encouragement to know that they're starting from a place where they may not be able to describe something like injection in their own words, but recognizing that importance of developing that skill and seeing how that grows over time. Also, separating out the process of speaking about concepts from actually learning how to do the hands-on work of like writing secure code. I know oftentimes those are lumped together in many training courses, but I think that when you separate them out, start developers with speaking about things first, then it's a much more gradual ramp up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Anyone want ice
Yeah.
cream right now?
But as we were
I'm on cold milk.
Very cold milk. Yeah.
as I was thinking about the show, I was thinking about my own process as well. You maybe not know, but my first language is French, and I remember in school, French grammar can be quite difficult. That you could lose. I was, very pissed about it. Like you could lose point, or you could fail a test in biology if your concept were not well written, or if you did not respect grammar rules within the topic. So meaning that French was important, or French grammar was important, whatever topic you were addressing. And as, frustrating as it was as a student, like, why am I losing points in grammar in a topic that has nothing to do with French? It did help me to write properly whatever I was writing and to think about it all along. So I think it has a lot of connection into like how you learn and making sure that you start from the beginning to do it well, right? And it's not something that you add on at the end.
Right. It's all about building that solid foundation. And what connects into that is the second focus area of this, of reflection and metacognition. Are any of y'all familiar with the concept of metacognition?
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay. Yeah, it's a fun concept because you can think about, as you're learning new things, you ask yourself, what do I know? And then the metacognition part of it is, how do I know that I know this? And you can also ask yourself, what don't I know? And how do I know that I don't know this? And what are some pieces that go in there? I wanted to include this because this is a key part of realizing how this workbook can help beginning developers. I know that I've sat in on many training sessions that deliver the OWASP top 10 in 1 hour. And it's a lot to get through in an hour. And when you think about what beginning developers may walk away with after that, how much of that material have they actually retained? Have they been given the time to really reflect on what they know and say, all right, I know we're at number 3, but I'm still kind of stuck on the second one. And there's some parts there that I need to clear up. And I know this because ... Okay. And so now, with that being said, let's go over to the workbook. There's already a bunch of people in here. Hello, Google Docs. I was like, at first, okay, so because I have kept this thing under wraps for so long, I'm so used to this up here just being like me, myself, and I. So I'm like, who is creeping in my workbook right now? My goodness. And then I remember, Olivia, it's public now. It's cool. Roll with it.
I shared the link to your website, and some people have some good skills into looking. They found it.
Awesome. Yay. Step 1 is complete. So this workbook, I'll start by saying I thought a lot about where I want to host this, and eventually I may move it to some more formal LMS, learning management system. But I thought for now, what's most important is getting this in the hands of developers to actually use and learn from. So I kept it simple with a Google Doc that anyone can open, either save to their computer, save to their own Google Drive account, and use it as their own interactive workbook. Scrolling through here a little bit, it follows the Google Docs approach of you can click in here to go directly to where you want to go. Just a quick note, I know that when you get in here by default, it does show the document outline, but some of this can be a little, there's a lot that's down there, so feel free to close that outline if you like. And I'm just going to do a quick scroll through here to show you some of the key points, such as links to some documentation, some recommended courses for learning about the top 10. As I mentioned, this workbook is not intended to be an entirely exhaustive resource in itself for learning about the top 10. It's more so your best friend on the side that's going to be there cheering you on and helping you think about how to really reflect on some of these risks and questions. And just going to scroll down a little bit to here. So here's where the teacher part of me is really going to kick in and try to give some a little bit of a pep talk for anyone who wants to really go through this. I know that page 3 may look a little bit intimidating for someone who is in that beginning developer category that I talked about. If you are just getting started with programming, you might look at some of this and think, I don't know what this is. But trust me when I say, take the time to sit down and write anything at all you can think about with this. Because the idea is to use this opportunity to reflect on what you already know. And so that after completing the workbook, you can do the same thing. You write what you now know, and then you compare the two together. To give you a very candid example of how I've needed to do this myself when I've been preparing for various certifications over the years. At one point, I was preparing for an AWS certification, and there was this service called Systems Manager. And I sat down and said, all right, Olivia, what do you know about Systems Manager? And I literally wrote, you use it to manage systems. And that's kind of sad, right? But that was where I needed to start. And later, once I completed the certification course, I did the same thing. And I had so much more to say about it. And I was able to compare and see that growth and progression and notice, hey, I actually learned some stuff. Have any of y'all ever done something similar when you were going through like a learning process, like this pre and post kind of reflection?
I think with the OWASP top 10, also, hi everyone, sorry, my internet was a bit bad, but I'm now on a different computer. I actually can empathize with this topic a lot because I've done OWASP top 10 training, but for sales and marketing. So not even for developers. And a lot of the titles, security configuration, it's like configuring systems, badly or well and stuff like, I remember when I first saw the OWASP top 10, I was like, broken access control, what does that mean? And you have to like literally break it down into the words. And then as you deep dive, it's like, okay, basically, yeah, let's not make everyone admin. Okay, I get it now. Having like those real life examples.
Yeah, exactly. And real life examples, that's so much of what I wanted to include in here. As I was planning this, one day I sat down with some friends and said, okay, give me an example of like a random company that would have some kind of website. And the friend said, a pet grooming business that works with Beyonce. And like, that is oddly specific. I'm not going to include that. But you do bring up some ideas that I could put in here. So you'll see this through the lens of the fictitious ABC company that has, ABC company really needs some help. Let's just say that. As you read through this, you'll see some examples of this. And for instance, with insufficient logging and monitoring, we have a quick introduction here. And this is a good example of what I mean by we're pausing and reflecting this back to the learner. So what are some of the actions that might be logged in online accounts that you frequently use? It's a way for the learner to kind of step aside from this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm learning about application security. I don't know anything about this, but to flip it and say, hey, if you're using email, shopping, social media, things that you're doing on those sites are being logged. So let's take some time to think about that. And the more personal that you can make it, that's what's helping to draw connections and get into something like what would be used for ABC company and so on. And as we mentioned earlier, the topic of how much to include, it's tricky because you don't want to make it seem as though if you do all of these things, you're secure forever, yay. But it's something to help them start thinking and also be able to have links to learn more. And I always encourage further learning. And I know that it's something that can help learners to feel, all right, once I feel I'm starting to see that I'm getting this, I want to learn even more. And here are some places to go for that. Any questions on that?
Well, I have a question regarding the workbook per se. Do you think that it would still be useful? What I found interesting with your topic when we spoke about it and prepare for this was that it was for beginning developers. You didn't have a requirement to know how to code before getting into it. Do you think it's still useful for people who have been already coding for a little while?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because as I started working on this, I thought that could also be another opportunity that's in there. I know, for example, when I was a classroom teacher and I would have so many of my students come to me and say, Miss Liddell, all my learning is done and you have taught me all I possibly need to know. Ha ha ha. I'm like, okay, first of all, no. I'm glad that you are learning things, but let's kind of see where we can take you to really develop that further. And usually I would encourage those students to, this gets into like that reflection and metacognition piece of teaching others. And I think that especially for some more advanced developers, this could be potentially a way for them to not only reinforce what they know, but if, for instance, they are in a mentoring partnership with a junior developer and they're not quite sure how to coach them and help guide their skill development, I think the workbook could be really helpful in that case too. And through that process, the more senior developer may learn some things from the junior that they hadn't thought about from that perspective. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities there for sure.
Perfect. I think Nikki had a question.
Yeah, just a question. Have you heard of, I think it was a book by Barbara Oakley about focus versus diffusive learning styles. Have you heard this before?
No, I don't think I have. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it sort of changed the way I think about a lot of these problems. It's basically like when you're learning a topic and you're sort of just like brute forcing it into your head, you're very focused and you're like trying to learn it as quickly as possible. And you're just sort of like focused directly on that topic and learning it, right? And then there's the diffusive mode when your brain is just sort of wandering around and thinking. You start to then take all these focused thoughts and you make these connections between these focused thoughts, which kind of become the real knowledge, right? When you're able to apply like thing A in a totally different situation, sort of like the cold milks topic that you brought up earlier. I don't know. It just sort of was a learning moment for me that was like, boom, like do all this focus learning and then your diffusive mind sort of ingests all that and then creates all these great connections. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought I'd share it to see if because you seem like you're very up to date on like education science. And I'm not as up to date. This is like, I read like 3 books, so.
No.
But you should drop it, Nikki, of that book. Or
I'll send you the book. It was a great book.
Yeah, please do. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, you know more than you're giving yourself credit for. Again, this is the teacher in me that's coming out right now. But I think you're spot on with that. This idea of making those connections between different pieces there, and especially for the top 10, it's so important for learners to be able to see that these top 10, it's not like injection is only ever going to be injection in its own little bubble, or that broken access control is the only risk that ABC company will ever have to deal with for its application. It's to be able to build up that knowledge, ramp it up, and then as they start to get more insight, make the pieces come together. But one of the most challenging.
Yeah, sorry, especially in this topic, like so much of it is conceptual, right? It's not like flipping a switch and having it fixed, and like there's no like on-off switch for these things. Like misconfiguration is a concept, right? So then it's like, okay, I'm configuring something, therefore I should be aware of misconfiguration. And you have to apply that in a million different scenarios. It could be the cloud, it could be an Exchange server. I'm sure somebody still is configuring Exchange servers, right? Somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's just a lot of different areas in which you'd have to kind of apply these sort of concepts. So yeah, and the challenge is recognizing that there's no way you can possibly address every single example of that, because there's always going to be someone out there who's like, well, this doesn't relate to my particular use case, so I'm going to skip over this because this does not apply to me. And I think so much of this does rely on the learners being somewhat self-driven. Because as so this is transitioning into the next part actually about the small pilot group that I shared this with, and it's a small group of friends from different industries, some in tech, some not, to get a sense of what they thought of it. And one part was that, Olivia, are people really going to sit down and answer all these questions? And my honest answer was, I can't force anyone to do that. I can encourage them. I can give them the materials, and hopefully they'll see if they want this, if they want that knowledge, they'll go through the exercises and start to figure out how they best learn about this and see if this is a good fit for them. And this group was so helpful in getting a sense of the kind of growth that's possible from beginning to and seeing things like, is this even designed well for the targeted audience? Because I wanted to make sure that I was not going super high level for someone who's coming in at more beginning. And especially the second point, I was so glad to hear the feedback that the reflection exercises really did help to spark some insightful thoughts for the learners as they were going through this. At the same time, though, that third bullet point is what we were talking about a little bit earlier on, the idea of how much content to include for each risk. And it's kind of like the concept of, let's say, if any of you have ever designed a survey that you've needed to send out, and perhaps because you want to get some kind of data,
and you have a survey that's like 50 questions long, because you look at this and think, this is all the information I need. The more information I can get, the better, right? But how many people want to sit down and answer a 50 question survey at one time, compared to, can you do that as like a 5 question survey? And you might not get as in-depth data, but you're going to get a higher response rate for that. And so that's what I was thinking with this too, that I don't want learners to look at this and feel that I'm overwhelming them with like 100-page long workbook that they see from the beginning, like, this is not for me. The trade-off is that we may not be able to go as in-depth here, but if I'm able to get more developers going through this, feeling that they can learn something, then I consider that a win. And
Olivia,
yes.
there's a question in the chat with regards to whether this system is only for live interaction or also online interaction.
Oh, good question. Yeah. So with the workbook, if you decide to download it to your computer as a Word document, or even do the Google Drive method of saving a copy in your account and putting it for offline access, you'll be able to do it that way. You can also be like me. I'm still very I love my printer, and I will print things out hard copy.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, totally me. Most of my curriculum, I often handwrite before I type it. Not like with a quill pen. I'm not that like classical, but still. I'm fancy. The next point on here, my friend Carl, who is a former CTO, he gave some great feedback and said that the question of focusing on how to discuss real world trade-offs that companies sometimes need to make when they're balancing security with their other priorities. Because so often you think about these ideas that exist as best practices in a vacuum, that like, if everything is sunshine and rainbows and companies have all the money in the world and everything's just perfectly lined up, we can have security everywhere and exactly how we want it. But I'm glad that Carl mentioned that, because I went in and was able to kind of tweak the questions a bit in a way that aligns with how would you do this, thinking about what else the company is needing to focus on. And the last question, or the last comment on here, my good friend Bob, who is he and I studied Arabic together, and he now is a college professor working in neurolinguistics. So I thought, Bob, I need your insight on this. I know you're not the security person, but you've got a lot of great insight to offer. He gave the idea of including multiple choice review questions. And this is definitely something that I do in the curriculum I create at work for like our AWS certification prep, because learners in that context are preparing to pass a specific certification that is multiple choice. And the curriculum that I design will have questions that include not only here's why response option A was correct, but here's why B, C, and D were each incorrect. And you learn from that. The trick is with something that, like with this, is not necessarily tied to a certification at this level. I don't want a learner to go through and feel like, okay, I selected the correct identification, I'm learning now. But what I'm going to do in the next variation of this is use Bob's suggestion of multiple choice review for more of those scenario things that Carl was mentioning. Now, to write really effective multiple choice questions, it is one of the most difficult parts of curriculum development for me, honestly, because it seems like it's easier than it is, because you have to create questions that aren't just gimmies and gotchas. Like, well, obviously it's option A, like B, C, and D don't, like, no one would choose those. You want to make sure that these scenarios are things that a learner would possibly consider, and then you guide them to the right path. So that's coming in the next version of this. Any questions before I get to the last slide?
Yes, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Let's take them. The first one is from, sorry, I'll take your surname, Migawaski. He asks, is it somewhat a bit dangerous to put less focused items compared to the original OWASP list?
That's an interesting question too. I would say, and it all depends on how you want to approach this. From my personal take on this, having so many conversations with developers who were looking at a list that starts with injection and seeing that this is something that is far too difficult for them to understand, and therefore they feel that if they're not understanding the number one item on the list, what chance do they have for getting beyond that and wanting to learn more? And so the way I would answer that honestly would be, I think it's more dangerous to have it so that learners feel that this is something that they cannot get into. And the approach I've taken of reordering it, getting it so that they can have an easier entry point into it, but still being aware of the official order that's prioritized and for the specific reasons that it is. That's a way to be able to balance those two priorities so that learners still get the knowledge they need and can relate that back to the list without feeling too intimidated. Hopefully that answers it for the viewer there.
Yeah.
I think on that as well, one of my favorite things, like I said, I've taught OWASP, and I've had it where I'm trying to teach XXE, which is number 4. Obviously, OWASP is written for security, so injection, very important. But when you're teaching it to people, what I really love about your approach is that you've thought about who the audience is and then relayed it back to them, and as necessary, change the order so that, it's easier to learn, and then mapping it back, obviously, to the original order. I think that's so awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's again, the whole time I was just thinking, and this is going to sound so cheesy and corny. I'm so sorry in advance for this, but honestly, as I was working on this, I thought, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but if this can help even just one person feel that security is something that they can learn, then that's all I want. Because the next time I go to a conference and I'm presenting my talk, and then afterwards I have someone come up to me and say, Olivia, this is great, but I'm too scared to get into security myself, I can flip it and say, guess what I got? That sounds creepy. Like, but you know what I mean? Like, here's a workbook for you. I've created something that can help you. So that way, I think it's just making it so that this content is accessible to anyone who needs it, even if that means putting it in a way that may be a little bit non-traditional, but sometimes flipping things around can be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question from Security Grid. They ask, when teaching, is it better to start with the acronyms first and then explain them as you go? Or
so with acronyms, what I usually try to do is name it first in full, put it in parentheses, and sometimes I'll refer to it back and forth as I go throughout. But I always make sure to try to include the full for things that are that may not be known. So like cross-site scripting, would put that in parentheses with the XSS and so on. Always make sure if you are teaching to include both the extended version of something and the parentheses, because I know it's so easy. Regardless of which industry you're in, there's acronyms for everything. And this gets back to language, right? This idea that someone who's coming in and hearing all these terms thrown around, they're like, what is this? And sometimes people may be a little bit afraid to speak up if they know they don't know something, but they don't want to make it known that they are the kind of the outsider at that time.
Yeah, but I think the question is asking whether or not we should first of all explain what XXE is before we go along, or are you only saying that we need to just say, okay, XXE is this?
Oh, okay.
And not explain what exactly XXE is all about.
Okay, if I'm sorry about the misunderstanding there. Thought it was just about the acronym. With XXE, for example, the way that I approached that was trying to figure out before you can even get to like what XXE is itself. You have to introduce the concept of XML. You have to sort of relate that to it's a markup language like HTML. Here's how it's slightly different. Then you mentioned that there's this thing called a parser. Then you mentioned there's this thing called an entity. Then you say, well, here's this concept of an external entity. So now that you've got all these things, here is how this can lead to some not so good stuff. And that, I know this is a recurring theme in what we've been talking about today, which is it's good because for anyone who's looking to get into trying to teach this, I think if you have an audience that's a smaller group and you know who your audience is, that's when you can leverage tools like a pre and post assessment that's like a short survey of what do you already know about XML, or what are you hoping to learn about this? And then if you see that most of your audience is coming in at a slightly higher level, you could probably either skip that or just do a very brief review in the beginning before going into what XXE is. But I think that for beginners, I definitely try to err more on the side of not making assumptions about what someone will know. Because if I did it where I just went in to say, all right, we're talking about XXE. XXE is when ... Then I've lost people who are just like, you're telling me what this is, but this sentence includes like 5 things that I don't know. So I need to understand those 5 things first. Does that answer that a little bit better?
Yep. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
So there's a few more questions. Oh, I don't want to. Do you have more slides that you want to go through? Or do you
I
want
just
me
had
to...
one more slide.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just one more slide with Oprah on it, because I had to include an Oprah meme in here. Just to say, I'm very excited to see how more developers will respond to the workbook. I've even included a little blurb in there. If any of you who are choosing to go through the workbook want to share your results with me at that email address, feel free to, because the more data that I have about how people are actually using this and where some of those pain points might be, what's easiest to get through, that'll be very helpful for me to see how to best further refine it. And longer term, I do want to incorporate this into a conference workshop that will probably include some more hands-on exercises, group discussions, and the workbook can be that point in there for learners to be able to kind of pause, reflect, and whenever they need to, in addition to all of that. And so I know we've got some more questions, but just want to say thank you all so far for all the great insights into this. And I'm really excited to see how people will be using this.
Yeah. So just a question about the workbook. It's Creative Commons license, free as in free license, open source. Is there a licensing structure attached to it, or it's...
Not yet, but I will put that on there. Yeah. My as I was developing this, friends were like, "How much are you selling this for?" I'm like, "I'm not selling this. That is, I mean, that's my intention is anyone who wants to learn, I want this to be something that free for them to use and learn from and share with others." So yeah, thanks for the reminder about that license. I'll definitely be tacking that on there. But sharing is caring.
Yeah, there's a question about translating it into other languages, if that's okay with you, but it sounds like that might be okay.
Yeah, please do. I mean, I could take the lead and put it in Arabic. I'll probably put something about the cold milk in there just because that's the phrase I keep coming back to. But yeah, I'm going to continue to update that. So, and you'll be able to get the latest updates there from the link with the Google Doc. But for anyone who wants to share it and possibly translate it, please get in touch with me. I would love to share that out on my end as well if it does become available in other languages. I think that's awesome.
Cool. So a question let me just scroll up and get it quickly here. It was about maturity. Yeah. Oh, there it is. All right. Any best practices on how product organizations for developers can basically gauge the security maturity curve with the top 10? That's an interesting question. Like, how do you know if you're good? How do you know if you've gotten it?
Yeah, and that, I'm thinking like my one way I'm thinking about this is just from the perspective of different assessments. Like, I'll start here. You've got different technical assessments that certifications that someone can take and pass, but how often does it happen that someone may be able to go in and pass with the right score, but does that necessarily mean that they're able to relate this to what they need to do on the job, not just with writing secure code in the workplace, but even being able to communicate about these things to various stakeholders, some of whom may be in non-technical roles. I think that's also very important to include too. So I think that if I were to sit down and try to figure out how to best gauge this, I don't have any, I don't have the perfect solution offhand right now, but I think that a key part of it would be this aspect I mentioned of the language of security, even just having, if you are doing some kind of internal company assessment, making that the open-ended part of it very essential of how would you describe this in your terms, in your own words? How would you how would you respond to this scenario and why? Why would you exclude this and that and so forth? And it may take a little bit more work to develop that kind of assessment tool and ensure that it remains up to date and seeing how people may progress that way. But I will say that throughout my experience as an educator, the best way for me to get a sense of where someone is with the topic is when you ask them to describe it in their own terms, and when you also give them exercises when they have to problem solve and also rationalize and explain why they did something in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that would vary by organization is like kind of what you're, sort of alluding to. I don't know. Every organization manages maturity in a different way, depending on what their security objectives are. So I think it's,
Yeah, and if you have an organization that is prioritizing X over Y, that can be something that's reflected in the developers' learning plans, for instance. I think part of it too is encouraging developers in an organization to take some initiative in their own skill growth and development and ongoing learning. And that's where that whole metacognition piece comes in. I mean, I know for myself personally, and just being very candid, I have gone through so many online trainings for different things where I go through a module, it gives me a little check, I feel like I did something, and yet if you flip it and you ask me, Olivia, what did you just learn? I might not be able to tell you something, but I got that check mark, so I did it, right? And so I think that when you encourage developers to step aside from the idea of training completion being the only measure of success, how can you kind of expand it out a bit to make sure that their continuous development stays in line with what the organization's security priorities are?
Awesome. Well, we're just past the hours. If it's 5 minutes over the hour, that's perfectly fine. But before we wrap up, I wanted to share a few resources. I actually added them to the show notes, but since we're OWASP, there's a bunch of open source things that you can use as well if you're interested in secure coding. I wanted to mention the Secure Coding Dojo, which is an OWASP project that you could take a look at. I put the link again in the show notes, and as well the OWASP Secure Flag Open Platform. If you missed the beginning of the show, we had an introduction saying how when you are an OWASP member, you do get access to an instance for members of to the OWASP Secure Flag Open platform. So becoming a member, you ask for your OWASP.org email, and then with SSO, you get access to the platform. So those are two resources from OWASP that are open source to get you started. There's also this new organization, the open source. Oh, now I'm forgetting about it, but they do have the new name, the Open Source Security. Okay, I'll look it up. But they do have a course on EDX, a free course on secure coding and security of software. It's actually a certificate based on three course that are for free, and you can pay to have some kind of certification that you've been through the courses as well. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you all. OpenSSF, thank you, Manuel, exactly, and Antonio, Open Source Security Foundation, and that OWASP joined recently with other communities. Okay, so that's what I had to share. So before we close, we end. Is there anything else? Let's do a little round table. Maybe Stefania, we missed your introduction at the beginning because of the technical difficulties. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure, I can. And I was almost sad because I was so excited about this session. So my name is Stefania Chaplin. I'm a solutions architect at a company called Secure Code Warrior. We really focus on the OWASP top 10, which is why I mentioned I've trained like my internal sales team on it. And my background's very much in kind of AppSec. I used to be a Python developer a while ago. But yeah, very, very much into OWASP top 10. So yeah, really enjoyed the session. Like I said, my favorite bit is how you've just reordered it, because not only with security, but with a lot of concepts, you have to think about, who is this thing for? What's the audience? Who wrote it? And what's the audience? Because especially a lot in tech, unfortunately, there are a lot of silos, especially with security and development. So to have that ability to just switch it, I'm like, oh, it's amazing. So yeah, really enjoyed today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Anybody else? Let me. Faith, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I just I saw a very interesting question that is rather controversial. What are your thoughts on gamification?
On what? I'm sorry?
Gamification of learning.
Oh, gamification?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me.
Yeah, it's a very controversial one.
I will be brief. I think that, okay, not all learners may be motivated by gamification. So for some who are not, it's kind of like a nice add-on, but it doesn't really do anything for them. For other learners, though, it can be helpful. So for those who are unaware, this process or this topic of gamification, it's the idea of adding in like game-like elements to the learning process. So perhaps instead of going through a module, you're going on a quest, and you have to be able to earn certain badges along the way, and then you can cash in those badges for other points and so forth. I think that it can be a very powerful way to engage learners, but I think the main takeaway I would say for this is don't fall into the trap of focusing more on how you're gamifying than your actual content. I've seen that happen sometimes where I can tell that a development team has spent 90% of their time creating the gamified elements, but then when you strip it down and think, what am I actually learning? It's like not really there. So that's something that I know can be tricky. But when gamification is done well, it can be a really great tool to help keep people engaged.
Well done. Nikki, you have the last words.
The last word. No, I think this is a great topic to explore. I mean, learning how to learn is like so foundational to success in this industry that I don't know if we could talk about it enough. And especially, it's a good time. It's January. It's the new year. We're all sort of thinking about how we're going to tackle 2021. I think it's a great time to kind of reassess what we're going to learn this year, how we're going to learn it, and how we're going to make it stick so that we can actually use it, right? Because I don't know. I think nothing's more annoying than when you learn something and you don't use it. It just sort of goes away, right? So, yeah, thank you so much. This was great. I learned so much from you in this last hour. I wish we had 2 more.
Yeah, I think yeah, a lot of questions still in the chat. Thank you everyone for being here. Before we end, I just want to let you know that in 2 weeks on January 24th, we have Maya Kaczorowski, I hope I pronounced this right, talking to us about software composition analysis. So make sure to join our meetup group or follow us on any social media and you will see what we have coming up. So that's it for us, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Bye.